Michelle.
Daniel,
OG
OG Rose.
Today we're going to be talking about transformative philosophy.
Transformative philosophy, which is in honor of the Voicecraft class that is starting October 10th.
Very exciting, and it's going to be taught by a great cohort of
Different people, Cadell and Johnny
Daniel.
Miller and OG Rose and Layman, Tim, Christopher.
That's right, Layman Pascal's going to be
Yeah,
there.
Layman's going to be the integral stage, so that's neat. And so it's looking very, very exciting, so it's cool to be part of it.
If you haven't watched the video, Tim has a great video on
It's
the
amazing.
class. On
The
YouTube.
his artistic
it was
ability
insane.
is insane.
So beautiful.
So it's really, really
So yeah,
beautiful.
go check that on Voicecraft YouTube channel.
No, it's really neat, and he and Cadell had a conversation
Yeah.
about the class, so that's exciting, and we had a little video on our YouTube page about it. But it's an interesting concept, transformative philosophy. So what do you think about when you hear the phrase transformative philosophy?
Well, I think about a philosophy that can maybe actually change something for you or change your life. And so I think that's interesting. I mean, I always think words are fascinating because then it's kind of like, transforming or transformative. It's like it's interesting because it's kind of thinking about what is formative, and this idea that what is formative ends up being a lot of times the transitions or transitory, things that you go through in your life. In birthing, there's like transition is one of the major points in labor. When you go from contracting to dilate till you're fully dilated to push the baby out. So I think there's something about that idea, this idea of movement being very integral in what is formative ultimately, which is strange because sometimes formative feels very certain and structured and solid. So I think that's a great word. And then we think about that in conjunction with, the love of wisdom or the seeking of wisdom philosophy.
That's interesting. There is a way in which transform has form, which you think rigid, you think structure, but transitional form, a form that is changing, kind of like a river, like water, Heraclitus sort of thing. So transformative, the structure, like metaphorically transform feels like water. And you mentioned birth, and that's associated with water. And also Socrates referred to himself as a kind of midwife. He's helping birth ideas in different things. And there's a way, it's interesting because there's both a sense in which ideas are not practical at all, and then you hear things like, you only control your thoughts or control your mind or battlefield of your mind, as if your mind is the most important thing on planet Earth. That all change starts in the mind. But then there's another way in which it's like ideas don't do anything, and it's kind of, or they're strange. And then you have this way in which there's a danger, kind of, like Walker Percy makes, he warns and kind of makes fun in his book, Lost in the Cosmos, about the self-help industry, where they, read this 10 simple rules to change your life and whatever, and some of that can be very problematic. And so there's a danger in presenting philosophy as a self-help book, because there's something about philosophy that, can force you to face your demons and have kind of great difficulty and disillusionment. And Johannes was talking about that, where any philosophy, any transformative philosophy that presents itself as a self-help book without any challenge, that there's some dangers in that. But then at the same time, there's a very real way in which the whole reason you study philosophy is because you feel a transformation that occurs thanks to it, or it changes your view of the world. So it's interesting to think of those tensions, which I find fascinating because, you don't see those tensions and say the idea of you need to eat well or you need to go exercise. It's pretty clear that if you exercise, there will be benefits to it. Where if you eat better, there will be benefits to it. But what's very interesting is the nature of this kind of transformative philosophy, or the notion of philosophy being transformative, seeming true and then at the same time not seeming true. And as it seemed in one sense it seems optional, and in another sense it doesn't seem it seems utterly critical. And it's interesting how philosophy has that tension about it.
It certainly does. Yeah, there can be this sense of if you're wanting philosophy to change your life, you're using it or something, which is strange. It's no, we, like you're saying, we don't think about that in what we consume or what we what other things that we use
Right.
our time toward or take in, right? Because it's all a type of taking in. You take in your food, you take in what you're learning about. So, but at the same time, it's like, well, why? But isn't that the point? Like, is it just mere enjoyment? I mean, it's
Right.
like that, and that's. I think that though the idea that it can change you, it will change you. Everything does, right? Everything does sort of do some sort of make some
Change.
sort of impact or change.
Sure.
You are what you eat, right? So
Sure,
what are you eating? What are you taking in? What are you consuming? It's so funny. Like, I just think it's so funny. We always kind of get this like big aversion to being consumers, and I get it. I get
Sure.
it from the
Sure.
the idea of market capture and such.
Yeah.
That's very real. But why is it real? It's because we are consumers. We consume food. We consume
Absolutely.
each other's time. We consume books.
Absolutely.
So it's really short. It's more about I think, what exactly is it that we are consuming? How are we consuming it? I think that transformative philosophy is going to look at both the what and the how.
Absolutely.
And I love that about Voicecraft, that they are very intentional with the how.
Absolutely.
In description, in placement, in phenomenology.
Absolutely.
And that's why I think like it's funny because like I was thinking a lot lately about self-help, the culture, and like the self-help mentality. And I was thinking about how like we tend to like self-help because we don't like to actually ask for help from others. It's much easier to quietly go and get your self-help book and take it back to your quiet isolation and read it. But you'll also feel the frustration of perhaps not really, feeling empowered for a time. But then you feel like, what this feels frustrating because I actually didn't get to execute the change I wanted to see through this book. Now, you did actually receive the words of that book
Sure.
from another person, okay? But it's much less vulnerable than having to proclaim your need to another person or
Sure.
literally receive like a baby help from another person. And Rivera has a great kind of wording for this, about this idea that you don't do change, you receive change, which I think is very important. But it's almost like, what is it exactly that we are allowing ourselves to receive, And I think perhaps it's almost like somehow, strangely, phenomenologically, a requirement to sort of put yourself out there, and present yourself so that you can almost be seen in your need and your helplessness to be able to actually receive something.
Well, that's a very interesting framing. So a few things. One, I think it's very true that you can't escape consuming. The issue, I think, obviously what people mean when they talk about consumerism, it's the eating and not giving back or not creating.
Mere consumption.
Mere consumption is what they mean. Mere entertainment, mere just kind of sitting back and having the TV feed, Netflix feed you the grapes of someone's creative toil and sweat or whatever. And that actually would be another subject, but there's something about consumerism that actually can kind of it's weird because it creates a culture of kind of creative judgment where people just like sit and say, oh, it was a good show. Oh, it was okay. Yo, I like that song. And there's like, the people who made it could have poured like 10 years into it.
Probably did.
Probably did, and great sacrifice. And there's a way in which one of the problems with mere consumerism is actually it can create a culture of judgment without appreciation of work, which is weird because capitalism is at the same time productivity obsessed. And that's another thing. Like on that topic, it's interesting to note that a problem with a lot of the self-help is like it does seem to just feed how to be a good capitalist, right? Like how to I guess that super popular book now is Atomic Habits or something, which, don't get me wrong, this notion of like you change bad habits by very small steps. I think that's a Japanese idea. That's very good advice, but then the question becomes like, okay, so you've mastered the art of atomic habits. What for? And philosophy would make you ask, what for? And it's like, just so you can be like, climb the corporate ladder and do what? And you see, that's where philosophy, when we're talking about transformation, has this disillusioning. It makes you ask, what for? And it can be frightening in that way. And you're like, oh my gosh, what is it for? And it makes you realize the potential arbitrariness of climbing the corporate ladder and different things like that. And that's why it is important to always realize that if philosophy transforms you, it has to like destabilize you. And one of the I guess you could say this, one of the problems with a lot of self-help work work is it doesn't destabilize you. Like, it doesn't existentially destabilize you. Like, for example, you already know that you don't see through your goals, and you're getting a self-help book to help you figure out why you don't. Like, there's no, like, awakening. There's no, like, shattering your world, making the earth feel unchained by the sun, sort of God is dead, parable of the madman moment. It's like, you know that you don't stick to your diet, so let me get a self-help book for how to do it. And that's where it is important to realize that in whatever sense philosophy entails a self-help ethos, it is not the same. It is part of, like, realizing that, oh my goodness, my very framework by which I'm taking in life may not be correct. And how do I see if maybe it is correct, but I need to examine it. The other thing that you were saying, and I'll, before giving it back to you, on this idea of real transformation has to be received, I think that's something I appreciate about Voicecraft, is because everything is about basically, it's in relation. Like, there's a certain sort of, like, how do you deal with your nervous system in breathing, like I think Johnny works on, is like how to be able to emotionally and psychologically position yourself to receive and to be present.
Like, and that's the thing, presence, right? There's this real sense of, like, before you actually are seen in your helplessness. The one risk with self-help books is you just stay in your isolation.
Yes.
You don't have to be seen in your helplessness. Nobody knows about it. I'm not saying that you should, like, broadcast all of your stuff, but like, or things that you struggle with. But there's this real sense in which it's not really going to the fullness of the helplessness, which is to sort of, like you're talking about with what Johnny would probably be getting into, this actual presence.
Oh, yes.
It's almost like if you're going to receive the presence, you have to also offer your full presence. And there's something about kind of coming out of the cave, sort of like,
oh, sure,
like being able to come out and sort of be willing to be, again, it's like this sort of nakedness in a sense, I think.
Well, what's interesting
that then, like, you actually, I don't know, somehow receive, like, your cloak or something like that.
Well, just to add quickly, I think it's, Raymond has been talking about this, and he has that great new book out on Notes from the Pod, where he really brought out the fact that, in Plato's Republic, there's a whole lot of emphasis on the gymnasium and physical training and different things, almost as if there is a certain physical conditioning that one has to go through in order to be able to handle philosophical reasoning. And if we tie it to what Johnny's doing, it's kind of the idea that if you can't control your breathing and you can't control your nervous system, then when the disillusionment and difficulty of philosophy sets in, you won't be able to handle it. And, with Raymond, a piece, that came to mind is the notion that, like, if you're not healthy, and this is like in the gymnasium where they're stressing health, then you are kind of at the mercy of the expertise of the doctors, and you can't think for yourself, because unless you're a doctor, how can you know that subject well? So there's a way in which Plato is suggesting, like, you want to be moral, because if you're not moral, you're at the mercy of the expertise of, say, the priest or the lawyers or whatever, because you're going to court. And if you're not healthy, you're at the mercy of the expertise of the doctor, because you can't understand your own health very well unless you're skilled in that. So there's a way in which health helps you keep yourself in the position or situation where you can think for yourself, because you're able to do that. You're not relying on outside authority. So there's a certain way you condition yourself to stay in the place where you can keep thinking for yourself. Well, likewise, there's a sense in which if you control your breathing, you control your nervous system, you control your emotions, you're able to then hold yourself in a manner to where you can enter in relations and not be overwhelmed by difference, or not be overwhelmed by their personality and, like, have a meltdown or something like that. And then what's interesting is it would seem like a lot of the transformative philosophy that will be going on in the class is really kind of talking about the particular philosophical insights and ways of holding that do indeed emerge in relation. Like if you're doing, like Dr. Lass on dialectical thinking, what's the relation between X and Y? They're dialectically opposed. So there's a relation there that you're thinking through. You're not simply thinking in terms of, say, conservatism or liberalism, to make some random examples, but you say, okay, well, what is the essence of conservatism that has something to do with the essence of liberalism, and how do they relate? There's a relation. We're talking about the phenomenology of voice. The only way that voice emerges in a manner that has a unique phenomenological experience that needs to be traced out is when you're talking with someone. When you're alone in the room and you're just talking to yourself, you don't have the same emotional experience as when you're talking to a person and you can't access their consciousness. You need the other person there to be a kind of canvas on which to explore the art of relationship and the experience of voice, of which, as the class will get into, is, I think, philosophically extremely rich. That particular phenomenological experience of the choice of saying something and responding to something. And indeed, relations transform people. profoundly. Arguably, there's nothing that transforms. Arguably, people's entire lives are oriented and organized according to their relations and what they do, and different things like that. And so, to talk about to position philosophy in and out of relationships is, I think, very important. And that would be a posture of receiving, because you're receiving the other. You're receiving that environment that is created only with others, and you can't find yourself.
Yeah, well, I think that's why this is a particularly unique and wonderful opportunity for people with this class, because they are, anyone who is going to be able to participate in it will be receiving the full presence of those who are sharing and teaching. And I think that ability to kind of literally be eye to eye with one another is a very unique, like you're talking about, a very unique experience of receiving. Like you're saying, possibly the only way we kind of truly receive it. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Buber and the whole being meeting, And,
well, I'd say it's very booby. I mean, you mentioned Javier, but there's something very
Buberian about
Buberian, because it's about with the address has a Buberian flavor to it. Absolutely.
Oh yes, absolutely. Oh, it's interesting actually that I was looking through some particular scriptures recently, and it was I forgot that actually the temple that God had Moses establish was not called a temple, it was called a tent of meeting. So that was very profound. It kind of stood out to me very, very much so when I was looking up another passage, but it just caught my eye. And yeah, it does seem to be the meeting place that it's funny because it's I just love wordplay too much. Sure. Probably. No, it's okay. I do. I'm obsessed with words. I am.
That's a good thing.
I mean, it's probably, I like it. It's better than a hardcore drug or something like that.
Yeah, I would say so. Between the OED and heroin, it's probably OED. It's fine.
The OED.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's great though, but I think that there's something there. There's something very substantial in a meeting. It reminds me of the word meat. MEAT. Yeah. There's something that there's something to sink your teeth into, and really chew, which is a strange language. And actually, this was something interesting that Tillis Bound said the other day. He shared that the word actually used by Christ at the Last Supper wasn't just take, eat. It was chew. It was a very unique word that actually meant to chew. It's very hard to accept that word. But I think at the same time, there's something about this idea of being able to actually, the expression, it's kind of I'll need to chew on that.
Yeah, chew on that.
Right. Really, that makes you think. And, we kind of have it's funny because our brains naturally want to mitigate thinking. If we can avoid it, if we can reduce it, it's weird. It's it both does and it doesn't want to. Like you say, the brain is kind of the frenemy. But the point of the matter is, if we can have these genuine meetings, we have some sort of meat to chew on together. And I think that type of chewing on is very, very thought-provoking, and that's really important, because the thing is, what we think is precious. There are really beautiful things that people think, often ideas and creations of their own, that are overlooked and not stimulated, so I think this will be a great chance for people to also kind of get in touch with their own transformation, which is a creative process itself.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the way you change yourself when you're alone in a room is different than how you change yourself around other people. And how you think about yourself is different around people than when you're by yourself. There are advantages and disadvantages to both.
Yes.
But then the question is, well, what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages? Well, if you ask that, you're now in philosophy. See, you can't even organize the benefits and negatives of social interaction or alone time, even. Without a philosophical structure, how do you create valuations? The moment you get into valuations or saying, oh, that is good, well, it's very difficult to see how you can say that without engaging in philosophy, unless it's just asserted. Sure, you can assert something is good, but that was the point that Socrates going. He was it's good to go try your dad? What do you mean by good? What is justice? Basically, philosophy, sure, you can go through your whole life asserting things. Philosophy is the realization that you asserted something, that you did not actually ground it, you just asserted it. Now, of course, it's kind of terrifying, again, to touch on that language, when you really get how much you think by assertion, not by actual earning or work or grounding. That opens up an entire, hole, an entire opening. But you see, basically, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that if we don't open that up, we can't open up to the other. Like, it's the same act. Like, you see today, like, how difficult in pluralism it is for diversity to not lead to basically social uprising, totalization, tribalism, all that different stuff. Like, well, that's because people, when they say they open up to the other, they're not actually opening up to the other deeply, only on a very surface level. Well, the moment you say open up deep versus open up surface, well, what's that mean? Well, you're in philosophy. It's very difficult to escape that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And yeah, and I think that there is something quite powerful with this idea of kind of like getting into the meta questions that require philosophy, and then also the realization that philosophy itself, the pursuit of it, and I don't know, I mean, sure, there's probably there's always everything out there regarding, like, maybe there's some little niche of philosophy that's like going to be like no process, but
sure,
generally speaking, most philosophy honors a process of some type, right? Because, like, love is always a process, right? If we think just again about the word itself, love of wisdom, philosophy, it's to love wisdom, and love is always a process, right?
Yes.
And so I guess what I mean to say is that I think what's beautiful about, like, training and kind of feeling more confident actually in one's own ability to kind of get out there and philosophize, get out there intellectually, maybe even physically, depending. It's very important, because I think what it helps too is, what it helps a person to do as well is to accept the process, right? Accept the fact that things, like, there's an ebb and flow, I think a lot of times when we don't acknowledge philosophy that does actually impact all of our thinking, like, as there's going to be secondhand smoke philosophy regardless.
Sure.
Whether you want to say whether you want to think of it as like some abstract, branch of study, or you want to recognize it as part of the everyday, it is still happening every day.
Yeah, you have thoughts. You have a philosophy. You cannot escape it.
You do. And, these... When you're able to have, like, an awareness of the fact that you do have thoughts, and how do you think, what are these toward, all of those things, right? What is, how are you mindful about them? Then I think that helps to understand that there's an unfolding. Like, and the thing is, if you don't, then you end up kind of really wanting to, I don't know, it's like always feeling very rushed and urgent in your fixing. In your fixing. And don't get me wrong, there are things like, well, look, if something's on fire, yes, put it out,
sure.
But we treat so much, like, because we have such immediacy today, and such, we have speed. That's a lot of what we have with technology today. We think of everything that way, and we don't really allow sometimes for the unfolding. And I think sometimes philosophy keeps a suspension of judgment, which is good, because you're going to have to be able to discern, right, or make assessments, but, throwing down the gauntlet of judgment is very suffocating.
Yes.
And does not allow for the process, and it does not allow for the learning, the true learning, but that can feel scary, because then it's like, well, how long is this going to take, or what did it, or, like, is this, it's kind of like what we talked about the other day with, like, getting a head cold or something. You kind of have to let it run its course. Yes. Well, you have to let things run their course sometimes, in terms of whatever it is you're experiencing or going through, or, anyways, I just think that philosophy honors that so much. And in being able to get confident in your own ability to philosophize, you also will develop more of a I want to say patience in a way, or something, some sort of, like, respect for the process. But also recognition of how you are able to, be able to see yourself apart from, like, some of the things you so quickly identify yourself with,
Yes. Well,
So anyways, yeah.
no, philosophy actually takes seriously that things are transforming. Like a transformative philosophy sees life as like transforming and things changing and becoming. And so it wants to create space to allow that to occur, not to just rush in.
Right.
One of the reasons why philosophy should train you to have an open hand is because it realizes how serious judgment is. Like if you say X is the case, well, you have made that is a big thing. You have literally said that the nature of reality corresponds with X. This is huge. You have basically made a move that a being like God makes. Like you have said X is true.
Yeah.
Like
or X
this
is false,
or X is false. This is a incredibly profound move. You are participating in the image and likeness of God in that act. You are participating in the very ontological foundations of reality in that act. Are you so sure? Are you so eager? There's a lesson in many religions of if you're going to call on the gods, that the problem is they may answer. There's this real sense in which it's like you really have to take seriously if you're going to say, like, if you say I believe in God.
Right.
Oh, you believe in God? Do you know what that means? Like, do you understand the gravity of a believing God? Well, arguably one of the reasons why religion has been in decline is because it actually hasn't taken seriously what it means to believe in God. It's not that it stopped believing in God. It's there's a way in which it hasn't taken it with the real seriousness of what that means. And so similarly, like basically when you make a judgment, when you say this is what's going on, or that person is bad, or this is the way you should live your life, or whatever, you are basically tapping into a kind of ontological foundational power. And it is a big deal, and you should take it seriously.
Yeah, see, that's really interesting. It makes me think of something I was thinking about this morning regarding the no-self concept in Buddhism. And I actually think this is what a lot of it is, and I don't know, it's hard sometimes with translation.
Sure,
and,
sure.
You're talking a completely different culture and
Sure.
understanding of the world.
Sure.
But I almost want to say that it's not as if, well, I can't be sure, obviously. This is speculation.
Sure.
But I wonder if there's something about the no-self that is actually saying exactly what you're saying. We can't just throw the gauntlet down about what this self
Yes.
is that we possess, we kind of are the vessels for.
Yes.
It's actually so it's so mind-boggling.
Yes.
That we and that's why it's a no self.
Yes.
Because there's no words for it.
Yes.
And that's where I think there's something about this, where there's a moreness in the knownness,
Yes.
There's something so much that you have to almost call it nothing.
Yes.
And that in the nothing there's everything kind of thought. And that's why I think it's confusing, because a lot of the language can just then makes it can reduce Buddhism to saying like, oh, it's just dismissing, it's very dismissive or
Sure.
even pessimistic about like
Sure.
human thinking and human existence. And it's
Sure.
like no, I think it's a much more robust understanding, and this recognition that we can't really say.
Sure.
And that actually opens us up to much more possibility.
Well, in meditation, it is not where you don't think. It's where you actually pay attention to thinking and going, oh my gosh, my mind doesn't shut up. It's always
It's just this
going.
constant flow of like,
Oh my gosh, how do I have any way of stopping that? One of the most difficult things in the world is actually not to think. It is unbelievably hard not to think. Like, try it. Like, try right now to turn off your thoughts and not have it suddenly wander to thinking about that chair right there
It's
or
funny.
the food right there. Like, it's really
funny that
hard.
you're asking that. It's like as you're still talking.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah, how do you stop?
expecting people to
Well, that's what I'm
comprehend.
saying. Like, it's very, like, how do you, like, it is so difficult to stop thinking.
Yeah.
Like, if you do it, and somehow every time a thought, like, this is the tricky thing. Like, how do you stop a thought without thinking about not thinking, without thinking about not thinking, and you enter into this kind of eternal regression? There's some way that you suspend your mind without the thought of suspending your mind. It's really crazy. And if you, in the act of trying to suspend your thoughts, is actually opening you up to the radical power and constant flow of thinking, because the effort of trying shows you that it's like really freaking hard. Like, this is the thing. Like, when we say, well, stop thinking, we act like that's so easy. Like, what like in Buddhism, there's a deep understanding of how unbelievably difficult that is. And so likewise, it's very easy to judge. Like, it's very hard to like suspend judgment, precisely so that when you judge that X is true and you're summoning upon ontological foundations, you're doing it with reverence and likely to do it right. Like, the Buddhist suspension of thought is so that when you think, your thinking is in your control and you're honoring it and you're controlling it. It is not a saying of where you don't think. Basically, it's impossible. It's impossible to literally not think. If you literally are not thinking, you are dead. So the emphasis on the no self, likewise, it's impossible not to have something of which corresponds with Daniel L. Garner. You will have something like a self. The emphasis on the no self is to make you realize that whatever you think yourself is woefully small and inadequate compared to the wholeness of it. So it's more like
the wholeness of it.
Yes.
Which is like, that's the other part too. That's the other part too, which is so funny, because it's like, it's just why we can't reduce things to, you know, mere tokens of X or Y or Z, right? Because it's kind of like the no self is this concept of no fixed self, because it is in such an incredible, mind-boggling, you know, connection and symbiotic relationship.
Well, to make the point more concrete, when I say to you, tell me what the world is, whatever answer you give will be so woefully pitiful compared to the wholeness of what the world is. Like, if I were to ask you what happens on planet Earth, I bet you're just going to tell me stuff that kind of comes to mind, or you've seen on TV, or that links with your life. Like, no one has ever even come probably within 0.01% of a full description of planet Earth. It would be more accurate to say that all we ever talk about is the no Earth, or the no world, because whatever we put forth is just such a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the whole, that it's more accurate to talk about the no self. It's very similar to negative theology or mysticism, where when you talk about God and you say God is good, it's more accurate to say God is not good, even though there must be a way in which God is good. It's just that by the word good, you just can't even be close to what is going on there. And so that I think is where you have to situate, say, Buddhism. Buddhism is coming to terms with that,
right,
where practices of no selfness are kind of an honoring of the infinite excess of the self, or the infinite moreness of being. And so, therefore, you see, we can see this in terms of philosophy, because what philosophy in academia has generally done has been a history of philosophy, which has been like the idea that you can never get the fullness of philosophy, where there's a way in which transformative philosophy is where you move beyond just talking about the history of philosophy to actually engaging in philosophy, and that's kind of like a no philosophy. That's where you open yourself up to the non-philosophy in this kind of Buddhist sense, where the excess becomes predominant, and once the excess becomes predominant, it transforms you, because you're like, oh my gosh, everything is way bigger than I thought, which has a kind of a terror to it. But then that terror is precisely an opening up to the fullness. Like, a real encounter with fullness almost always has to bring terror, because it's the whole.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I agree with you completely. And I think what's pretty powerful and amazing too, though, is in that same moment of terror, there seems to be this sudden realization of the fact that the world is really the world you know, right?
Yes.
And how unique that it is that you have a particular understanding of the world from your perspective.
Yes.
So then it ends up being, yes, it's still like a no world in a sense.
Yes.
But it's like that's kind of the beauty of it. It's almost this little gem. Everybody has these little gems all over the world that then make this entirety
it's a no
of
world
an
with the
incomprehensible
no
world.
in parentheses. It's part of the whole, and yet it doesn't equal the whole, but it's also not irrelevant.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's kind of like, oh gosh, I'm not even going to try now. But this is definitely reminiscent in, like, you know, even in Sufism, I'm thinking about Rumi and like this idea of the, you know, it's like the idea that like it's like the ocean, or are you the ocean? There's some language of that. It's probably has something to do with like a teardrop, but now I'm not recalling the exact language for it. But it's basically that idea, like, you know, is the whole world out there, or is the whole world like almost within yourself? And I think though it is this really, I do think that there's this like a direction of a negation that Buddhism does very well, where it recognizes actually the fullness of everything that cannot be understood or comprehended and you're there, and so in that way, it's like you're saying, it's like the no in parentheses world.
Well, I mean, Tim Adlin with the voice, there's an emphasis, like there's talk, in the video, or there's the kind of imagery is kind of pointing to the subconscious, the archetypal structures found in Jung, this kind of idea that there's this deep, deep world, or even when will be sort of some of the psychedelic conversations and the idea that there's this whole, like, fuller reality that, be careful if you tap into it, but also if you don't tap into it, then why would you ever expect your life to be different? There's this, it's another funny idea that there's a way in which it's difficult to articulate why philosophy is transformative, but then there's another way in which it's hard to think of anything but philosophy as transformative. like it's weird because it's like, how does philosophy change your life? It's like, yes. What else could? But then it's like hard to put into words, which actually the very fact it's hard to put into words can be evidence that it is transformative. Like the more difficult it is for someone the more difficult it is for, say, a Christian to tell you who Jesus is to them, can be evidence of they've never ever read the Bible, or it can be evidence that they've had a true, deep, mystical experience of Jesus. Right?
Oh, this is good.
Yeah, so what ends up happening is it's this weird thing where the inability to put into words is simultaneously a suggestion that there's nothing worth putting into words, and a suggestion that there's something that's been encountered that's far greater than words. So likewise, to talk about the no self can be evidence of never doing self-work, or it can be evidence of doing so much self-work that you realize that the self is ultimately just great. It's always in excess of whatever thing you define.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, the idea of, like, if the person has a hard time describing Jesus, and does that mean they've, like, never read the Bible really, but
right.
Or it doesn't mean they've had, like, actually a mystical encounter with Jesus. That's been kind of a question for me in thinking about self-help, actually, is like, and thinking about this from a theological perspective. It's really funny, right? Because if you see somebody who seems to be doing something that's difficult, okay,
yes.
overcoming something or whatever, phenomenologically, they look exactly the same.
Yes.
They look exactly the same if they're doing it, quote unquote, in their own strength, or if they're doing it in the strength of, the Lord.
The Lord, right.
And it's like, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's a very interesting, because then phenomenologically, it's very difficult to tell the difference between somebody overcoming in their own strength, in sort of maybe even a prideful way, or maybe not. Maybe they're just doing it themselves, or they're doing it with, like, this divine aid or assistance, like through the Holy Spirit, from a Christian perspective,
Sure.
And so it's like, that's really, really, to me, very interesting, and I think it's also why change is difficult.
Yes.
Because we don't have some sort of phenomenological cue of, like, okay, now we're letting go and letting the Spirit do it. You know what I mean? Or whatever. You could think of some other type of, like, force, but that there's not. And now, I will say that, like, I guess now when we look on as people, we'll definitely not know, okay? But sometimes in your own self, you can have, when you're closer to it, when it's happening to you or through you or whatever, it's much easier to it's not like your skin's glowing, right? But there's some sort of strange, it is a kind of supernatural or supernatural ability that suddenly you find in yourself that you're like, I really definitely didn't, like, I couldn't do this myself, but somehow you're doing it yourself, but you're not doing it yourself because you're doing it with, like, this divine aid or assistance. So I just think this is very interesting, because sometimes too there can be for somebody who's desiring to possibly make some sort of change in their life or have some sort of transformative experience, it can fuel. I think there can also be the sense in which, like, I'm opening myself up. Like, sure. Please, I'll take it. I'll let it work it through me. And yet, if for some reason it doesn't happen or something, what's going on? Like, is the person not open enough to receive it? Like, what's going on? I think there can be a deep sense of discouragement there. And so I wonder what might be occurring. What are your thoughts, Daniel?
Well, one of the things that philosophy teaches is that a lot of the great changes are in fact invisible. They are things that are not socially observable. and yet you also know that there's a way in which some of your deepest relationships are with people of whom get that you went through something invisible because they may have gone through it as well, and it may be never directly said, but there's a sense of it, and there's an intuition that this person has been through some of that change, that there's no social representation or social metrics by which to really get, or it's not very visible, but it completely transforms how they carry themselves. Like, you run into people that have certain auras, right? You can encounter that there are people of whom is different, and yet if you were to ask them, what did you do to be different, they may not be able, be like, well, I did X, Y, and Z. Be like, well, this other person did X, Y, and Z. Why don't they have the aura or whatever, or this different way of being? Well, because a lot of the deepest changes are in fact inside, like engaging in these meditative practices, which if you're, to use that Buddhist example, if you're meditating, you look like you're sitting there doing nothing. And if you have one person who literally is doing nothing and another person who's engaged in a true battlefield of the mind, learning to capture their thoughts, they phenomenologically look the same. One of the reasons why self-help doesn't necessarily go where it needs to go is because it doesn't force you to ever engage in a task that only you know you're engaging in, which requires for you to do something that only you understand. The very willingness to undertake that task says a lot about you. Says a certain level of bravery, or facing yourself, or being willing to do stuff that you don't know if it's going to work out and that other people may not understand. There's a certain bravery of which requires a certain kind of character to even be willing to engage in that. And to be willing to engage in something that other people may in fact view as a failure or a waste of time or different things like that. So there's something about if you are willing to do something that looks like you're doing nothing because you know that is the thing that's actually on a deeper level changing you, there's a risk. It's like a form of risk taking. That there's a deep social risk taking that you're taking, that the very fact that you're willing to take that risk in of itself is transformative.
Yeah, no, that's really good. That's really good. And I think too, Daniel, something that came to mind as I was talking about this idea of the person who's like, I'm open to receiving, and I'm open to receiving change or transformation. I think too, something that could perhaps be a helpful thing to consider is that it's not done, It's still, it's like, this is the idea of the process, right? We can't, if we think to ourselves well, I haven't changed yet in this manner or whatever, well, don't be so quick to throw that gauntlet down, right? It's like, you're still changing.
Well,
you're still changing. So I just think
absolutely. A lot of people will indeed be open to changing and improvement if it will be socially validated and everyone can see that they're putting in hard work to change. But it's an entirely different matter, and I think very rare, to have people that are willing to change and are open to change and becoming, if they're not going to receive any confirmation from other people, or if it's not definite. A lot of philosophy,
or if it will be ridiculed,
or it will
not be understood by people.
A lot of philosophical change, there's no guarantees. In fact, there's no guarantee that engaging in philosophy will change your life. And in fact, it's precisely that lack of guarantee that's part of its transformative power. There's no guarantee if you put in 20 years to write a novel, that novel will get published and you'll be successful. And yet the very fact that it may not be the case has a transformative element to it. The willingness to go all in and to really work at something without guarantees is a transformative act. One of the reasons, again, self-help I don't think changes people deeply is because it doesn't have that level of risk. Whereas there is that level of risk in philosophy. When you go into philosophy, you may have your entire worldview destroyed, you may have all your beliefs wrecked, and you may become existentially destabilized and struggle to relate to people at work and never come out of that. That's a very real possibility. Yeah. Dante could have descended into the Inferno, gotten swept into a temptation, and never made it to Beatrice. That was a very real possibility, and yet there was no other way to get to Paradiso except through hell. That's where Virgil led him. Yeah. There's real risk.
I think real risk, and I think the thing too is that always to see, just like some of the church fathers and the in the monastic tradition sort of talk about the idea that it's actually through temptations that one sort of develops more faith.
You don't develop by avoiding temptation.
Right. And the thing is, that's why it's kind of well, look, if you're on the battlefield, I'm not trying to justify falling into temptation, but the thing is if you're on the battlefield, you will get shrapnel. You're going to get you're going to get hurt. There's going to be some, but don't give up. I think the whole idea of like you're saying, somebody who's willing to keep on going and persist. that must be kind of like recognized, and I think can keep one continuing on.
Yes.
To recognize that is something special, and to not give up, and to let yourself basically like remove the shrapnel,
yes.
patch it up the best you can, let it heal as you keep moving forward.
Yes.
I think too, like I was thinking about this idea, actually, somewhat unrelated, but it's related. I was thinking about how we have kind of I'd like this to be the case, that like we're so progressed we won't have wars and
sure.
stuff like that. Who doesn't want there to be peace, right? Everybody
sure.
wants there to be peace. But I did talk about this a bit in like Violence in Life, my like little
sure.
Anchor recording
yes.
a while back now. But we have lost a bit of touch with like fighting, right? Basically. Yes. Oh, I had this thought experiment too. I was like, what if all wars had to be fought by wrestling? There's like no, I think that would be great, because like you'd actually have to wrestle through. You'd actually have to like smell the scent of like this other type of culture, what foods they eat, what they eat. Anyways, there's kind of a lot there that I think would be interesting to explore. But the idea is that basically we've lost touch with a sense of fighting.
Sure.
I think fighting's just like rude or bad. And
sure.
don't get me wrong, like people shouldn't just be punching each other all the time. But there's a healthy level of understanding that like we actually are in a sense needing to fight things. Like we do have to fight certain things in ourselves, and it is truly a fight. And I think to keep going in like a process of transforming is a type of fight itself.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Basically, the only transformative philosophy has to have some sort of fight to it.
Yeah.
Some sort of. Well, Raymond in his book, with the word I cannot say.
Nobody's
Themos. Was it Themos? He even gave me the pronunciation in the comment. I can't remember. Oh no, Themos. But anyway, Thymos. We'll say.
It's all right.
Spirit. Spirit was the alternative term. Is this notion that one of the kind of virtues that comes out in play is this notion of spiritedness, like the fight, the battle, the rising to the occasion, the sort of challenge, and how so much of global capitalism today doesn't have that spiritedness. And as a result, it's the last man that Nietzsche warns about, and so on and so forth. If you take away from human beings any possibility of fight, or even kind of moralize ways of life that avoid fight, something dies. There is something in human beings that only lives if it fights. And if there's no fight, then it is dead. And
we're not like talking about petty fights or something like
no,
that.
No. We're not talking. We're talking about noble.
Noble fight, the battle, the struggle.
Well, part of the problem. Look, part of the problem is like people who take noble fighting seriously don't get into petty fights. Mm-hmm. Petty fights is precisely evidence of a lack of a spirit. Mm-hmm. There's lots of arguments. There's lots of drama. Like basically, the world today is full of drama.
Yeah.
But it's not full of like a battle, like a cosmic sort of like war against oneself. Like there's like this drama and there's disagreements and different things, but there's not this like spirit. Well, I mean, it's like Hegelian language of spirit, like spiritual warfare is what religions talked about. Right. No one thought, Christianity, when it talks about spiritual warfare, is not talking about like getting mad because someone forgot to turn the dishwasher on. Spiritual warfare is like, hey, you're a human being. Oh, you're caught in the middle of a cosmic conflict between forces of good and evil and light and darkness, and you're a sinner, but you're also like made in the image and likeness of God. Hey, you better figure this out. There's no time to worry about the dishwasher. I mean, like that's the other thing. Like if you take seriously thymos or spirit or spiritual warfare, things like the dishwasher are not ignored. No one's saying they don't matter, but one becomes slow to. You just don't have time for drama. For petty things, because in the big scheme of things, they do not matter. So actually, funny enough, although this is the irony, because most of the world's problems are a result of irony, is that we're so concerned about fighting and drama and different things that we don't talk about thymos or spirit or battle, and as a result, we end up in endless personal drama. Like, because we don't have spiritual warfare, because we don't want to be violent, we want to emphasize peace, we actually end up in perpetual relationship drama. And then what's funny is you end up in a kind of drama. Drama does not transform. As we're defining drama here, drama is not transformative. Whereas spiritual warfare, let me call it that, spiritual warfare, because you can mean it theologically or you can just mean it Hegelian by spirit.
That's true.
Spiritual warfare is transformative. And basically, when we talk about transformative philosophy, it's spiritual warfare is ultimately what you're talking about.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Like it's look, better to have the warfare within yourself than the warfare of shed blood between nations. That's the thing. It's like it ultimately. I mean, it's a much, it's a much
and I'll
broader
just add
discussion,
this comes out in international politics. Weak nations go to war, not strong nations.
Right.
It's the exact opposite of what people think. Weakening nations and weak nations go to war, not strong ones. So nations that do spiritual warfare don't end up in World War III per se.
Yeah, no, it's I think too I think that's just really important. I feel like we've talked quite a bit over the years about the idea of like, what ends up causing petty fights or disagreements or arguments over, sort of like when you're grappling. See, this is the thing. This is why I would go back to this idea of like the wrestling nations, right? If you grapple with the questions of life, you end up grappling that with one another. There's a type of brotherhood, sisterhood,
absolutely,
some sort of thing that bonds you in that grappling with these questions that is wonderful, and you position yourself not like against one another, right, but like almost like you battle these ideas, and then you end up sort of battling yourself really ultimately, like
absolutely.
And that's good. It's not a bad thing. I'm not saying to like obviously this can get like, if it's off the rails, then you can become self-derogatory or like
sure
whatever. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm talking about a healthy level of sort of battling yourself, but that also means you're strong, you're a soldier, you're capable, right?
Yeah.
And it's like there's something that's quite humbling about that, but also empowering.
Well, there is nothing that cannot be pathological if misordered.
Sure.
Love, if it is not held in a healthy balance, becomes neediness, and love smothers people. Helping people can make them dependent if it's not in the right order. So likewise, this notion of needing a bit of spiritedness or fight, if it is not in the right order, becomes destructive.
Sure.
Everything is destructive if it's not in the right order. Beauty without love and truth attracts people to death. So truth without goodness and beauty is a blunt object that ruins people. So everything is bad if it is not rightly balanced or dialecticized. So likewise, when we're talking about this spiritual warfare, yes, of course, if it is not balanced within all the other virtues, it becomes a force of destruction. But thymos, the spiritual warfare, like if we think of it in terms of Hegel's reason, the movement, what I call the absolute choice, the movement from A is A to AB, from self-consciousness to reason, and we talk about spiritual warfare in reason, well, what happens then is it's not warfare. Basically what ends up happening is most people fight within an us versus them, as opposed to making the them part of themselves.
Yeah.
Like you move the us versus them from something external to something internal to yourself, and you realize that the enemy, the thing that you need to fight is not those, Democrats, those Trumpers, those whatever, Nazi, whatever. The enemy is yourself, in a way. And your own ability, your own tendency to judge situations in accordance with your preferences, your own tendency to escape responsibility, your own tendency to not put in the work that needs to be done so that you add value to your situations as opposed to drama. Like there becomes a sort of idea that, oh, I need to be perpetually engaged in spiritual warfare because I as a human being have a tendency to enter into irony, pathologies and problems that that ruin things. And so you engage in a spiritual warfare to make sure that you don't fall into those things that you will otherwise naturally fall into, because the brain is the frenemy. It's going to put you in those places where you're creating drama or falling into irony. And in that sense, transformative philosophy is a daily choice and a daily practice to not fall into those ironies, into those pathologies, and to say fall into drama as opposed to spiritual warfare. Transformative philosophy will be training you to daily live in spiritual warfare as opposed to endless personal drama.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think too, this idea, right, I think that's quite right. And I think like the real cool impacts of that is like you actually end up having much better relationships.
Yes.
It's quite wonderful because you realize that like it's not being pitted against one another. It's like there's a real sense of camaraderie in the fact that you're all in that orientation towards, well, look, it's sort of the me versus me, and it's this attempt to move forward in a sort of progression of thought and challenging that thought. And I always love your point, Daniel, on the idea of, this idea of confidence versus certainty, right? Where, it's like muscles, right? If something has to be certain, it's almost like glass, very fragile,
Absolutely.
And if you have to be certain, then any type of challenge to that is just completely destabilizing.
Absolutely.
In a shattering way. Now, your muscles get destabilized when you work them out, right? When they take pressure, right? When they take repetition, right? Or more weight. That's destabilizing too. But the beauty is that confidence is like building muscle, right?
Yes.
It can welcome change. It can welcome new ideas. It can welcome difference. And it does so gladly because it knows that that's actually the means by which it is made stronger.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I always love that distinction you make with confidence versus certainty.
Well, confidence can be anti-fragile, whereas certainty has to be fragile because a single doubt and it's lost.
Yeah. And it's so funny. Like, I think that, again, it's such a great point, because the word confidence, it also speaks a bit more to our need for relation, right? These meetings in the Buberian sense, right? Like, confidence is like having a confidant, right? Like there's something about being able to confide, and there's this interesting ability to sort of like be in it together in sort of like the dialogical process of exploration of ideas and thought in philosophizing, and that's what is transformative. It's like you are changed in this sense of exchange.
Well, you're bringing, on this, so again, we've been pointing to this sort of idea that it's weird. Philosophy is transformative, but at the same time, it doesn't seem to be transformative. I think the ways that philosophy are beneficial actually come out in relationships, where one of the reasons it's been a major problem to associate philosophy with an individual act, something you do alone, something that you read on your own, because you don't see the benefits of philosophy alone very much. You're the same person, you think thoughts, maybe you change your thoughts, but you don't really see a very strong contrast. Whereas when you engage in not just the history of philosophy, but real philosophical thinking, and thus learn the art of ideas, the art of conversation, the art of thinking through things, then the way you relate to other people is very different. It is in relationship that the transformative potential and possibility of philosophy comes out. Where if you just think about, if you ask the question, how does philosophy transform you as an individual? Individually, you don't see it as much. It's not so vivid. But in relationships and between philosophical individuals, when you get people together who have engaged in philosophy, you definitely feel the difference of the relationship. You definitely go, oh my goodness, philosophy matters. But when you're alone and you're asking, does philosophy matter? It's kind of more difficult to tell because you're not running against anything. You're just kind of the flowing river, right? So you just flow, and whatever thoughts you have, it doesn't tend to be extremely consequential, except maybe in facing fear. I think fear and anxiety, fear and worry is a topic that brings out the benefits of philosophical topics, which say we talk about in Turn the World or different things. But really, you really see the transformative power of philosophy between people and in relationships. And that would actually speak to why it is such a huge mistake, and one of the reasons why philosophy has arguably been in decline socially, on a social level, is because people have engaged in philosophy alone, as a solitary act, as something you do by yourself, which is the condition in which you do not see the transformative power of philosophy. The transformative power of philosophy comes out in a gathering of people who are mutually committed to truth, beauty, and goodness.
Well, yeah, this is great. I mean, that's the whole point I was saying before, about you quietly go to Barnes and Noble to the self-help section, you grab your book,
exactly.
You go back into your isolated bubble or cave or whatever, and or pod, to use Raymond's language. It's and then you just read it there. Yeah. And thing is, we've been talking about this idea of the inner battle and the spiritual warfare. So yes, in a sense, even when you're with yourself, yes, in a sense, you're that flow, right? There's nothing challenging your thoughts necessarily, blah, blah, blah. But you do have this inner spiritual warfare. But honestly, a lot of times, even that inner spiritual warfare has to do in some way with others,
Absolutely.
with relations or relationship to desire,
Absolutely.
which can, or
Yes.
can involve people, objects, substances, whatever.
Yes.
So it's like there's always some sort of relational element that, like, in and of yourself, yeah, you're just like,
Sure.
it's that flow, like you're just like in that flow, you're
Sure.
like that flowing river, like you use that language for that. It's always when you're getting into the sense of relation, and we could get a bit more into that, but the main idea is like it is, you're right with what you're saying, it is in relation that everything becomes much more vivid and discernible, and so yeah.
Well, and that's why with the Voicecraft class, this, in October, starting in October, is that so much of it is, in fact, sort of linking philosophy with relationships. Like with Johnny, Johnny and Todd Christopher, like Cadell, ours, Phenomenology of Voice, Pascal, all of these are philosophy that involves other people and interactions with other people and how you think so that you're open to other people. They're all in a relationship concept, like in a relational contract. Like if I were to ask you, what difference does it have on your life to be a Kantian or Hegelian or a Schopenhauer, someone that believes in Schopenhauer's metaphysics or whatever, and I were to ask, what difference does that have on your individual life? Probably, it's like, I don't know. Like, I still eat, sleep, and whatever. Like, being a Kantian versus a Hegelian, like, what does that do? Maybe it shatters your, like, oh my gosh, there's a noumenon and we can't crowd. Maybe it has a shattering effect. But what does it do to change you? It's very difficult to say. I'm not saying it doesn't at all, but it's kind of difficult to articulate. But when you're around people for whom have even, like when you draw into relationship with someone who has asked the question, should I be Hegelian or Kantian, and someone who has not asked that question, the difference in the nature of the relationship is very vivid and it's very clear.
And it's actually like it's truly quite it's really quite something. Like it's hard to put into words. It's quite an incredible experience. I don't know that everybody has. I hope that everybody has a chance to have that experience.
Well, you can if you don't do philosophy.
Yeah, right.
And that's why actually, that's why emphasizing philosophy as an individual act is problematic, because if you do it that way, then the transformative elements of it are not vivid. And so then why would you pursue it? And so you miss out on those experiences. That's why thinking about philosophy as being as the vividness of the transformative of potential of philosophy coming out in relationships is very important to emphasize, because that by emphasizing that, you increase the likelihood that people have those experiences and they don't miss out on it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think that there's always kind of something in the actual, also the fact that it becomes much more dialectical. Like you've already got people in and of themselves doing this sort of like dialectical process of learning, unlearning, relearning, right? But then you put that together or in exchange, and you have this sort of exponentiating effect
Absolutely.
Of the dialectic, and it's quite, and that's where too you've got this very amazing spontaneous generation of ideas.
Absolutely.
That's always really fun to witness and to see.
Absolutely.
And there is something quite spirit-like about that.
Yes.
In the Hegelian sense, or even if we think theologically,
theologically.
because there's something very, it's almost like there's like when two or more are gathered, there's so I am with you. And that's like, there's something kind of like, oh wow, you just don't know where it's going to go. Very, very, very cool. And revives that sense of wonder. Because you it's just so neat. You're like, you're kind of talking about an idea, and then somebody just suddenly shares a direction of it, and you're like, wow, I didn't even think about it that way. And then suddenly it spurs on thoughts that you may have never had on that topic. But it also comes from the time spent for each individual in what they're pursuing and reading and learning about.
Absolutely.
In their own pursuit. So like it reminds me a lot of the Nouwen book, where there's the discipline of solitude and then the discipline of community. Mm-hmm. I feel like you feel it quite richly in a philosophical engagement, because you have the solitude where you're like just individually learning about X or Y or Z, and you do that, and then when you get to have the discipline of community, he talks about this idea of of a type of silence held, which I think Voicecraft does a really great job too of setting up the stage for that, kind of setting the tone for a reverential almost experience of this birthing of where this in Hegelian spirit might move the conversation. And so and Nouwen talks about this too, and he talks about that it's a silence that then births creativity, and what is shared and what is engaged, like how people engage with one another, does yield like freshness and this vitality. And so it's really beautiful because all this sort of new all these new thoughts kind of come. It's almost like really neat to see just even the formation suddenly comes out so much more richly and ripely. Maybe you had this sort of like idea in and of yourself in your own research, but then you sort of talk about it and it's like, wow, this is I really need to kind of hash this out. And just by talking about it, I suddenly like have gotten to be able to process through what I was trying to think about on this thing. And it's just really neat to be able to experience that in community, in this type of discipline of community that Nouwen's kind of talking about. I think this is exactly what it is.
No, you said a lot of very important and great things there. There's something about philosophical relationships that naturally find a dialectical balance between solitude and community, being alone and working, whereas problematically when you have a history of philosophy emphasizing philosophy is an individual thing and know yourself, which is true, like know thyself, but it kind of individualizes it. And if you take it that way, then you can make the mistake of it not being dialectical. Whereas when you kind of think about like knowing thyself with thyself, becoming other, if know thyself is linked with Hegel's becoming other, then it becomes a know thyself that is only knowable with others. And that's like the critical move that Hegel will make there.
Well, yeah, I think there's kind of two sides of the spectrum. There's kind of the people who do think of philosophy as merely a subject, like a class, like in the sense of it being like, oh, it's just like philosophy 101, it's just a history, it's just like a boring lecture. For people who think of philosophy that way, it ends up being the emphasis tends to be on community and not on solitude.
Yes.
And then you've got the other side of the spectrum, which would be where it's philosophize in your isolation, where it's just the emphasis is on solitude. And I think that's why Nouwen makes such a great point that like these things must kind of come together. We need to allow them to meet.
Well,
absolutely. And so it's like that's where I think a type of transformative philosophy is doing just that, where you bring it together, the solitude and the community.
Well, what transformative philosophy will have you do is think in terms of how do I bring life to people? Like, how do I bring life to people? Not just simply say, oh, there's life when people are around. Yeah. No, there might just be drama. Oh, there's life when I'm by myself. Oh, well, maybe you're just afraid to encounter other people. The question you ask is, how do I bring life to people? And philosophical individuals, if you will, ask that question, how do we bring life to one another? And so you do work alone, so that when you're with people, you have something to bring there, because you want to help bring life. You want there to be life. So there's this kind of individuals do their work, but for the sake of the other, not to just kind of like know themselves and have some sort of like solid identity, but for the sake, it becomes what is the art of life? How do we bring life to one another? And transformative philosophy takes that very, very seriously. You brought up the Holy Spirit and the notion that when two or more gather, I think is a very important idea, because when you're with philosophical individuals, not only does the conversation have a life to it and a spark to it and can go on for hours and hours, there tends to be something about philosophy that makes you see life as alive, as part of a bigger story. And so the people, they're more likely to be creative, to tell jokes, to be funny, to have adventures, to have plans, to be working. Oh, I just did this painting. Like, philosophical individual, it's not by chance that a lot of artists are philosophical and a lot of philosophers are also creative, and it's not by chance they always are working or something, or that they're open, or that they have a good sense of humor, and that they're witty. All these things go together because there's something about philosophy that brings all of these things. Philosophy doesn't just bring philosophical ideas. It brings with it an entire disposition to life that is fuller. And so when you engage in philosophical relationships, it's like an entirely different world. And you see that philosophy in that sense can change the world. that it in fact can introduce a new kind of world, that it can be transformative, but it is in community and relationship that comes out. And so when you think of philosophy as a solitary act, you don't get that bringing in of a new horizon, a new way of being doesn't really come out. And so it's hard to see how philosophy is transformative. But when you have, and I think the internet today is making this more possible because it's easier to connect people who have done the philosophical work, whereas before it was more difficult to find that one out of 1,000 people that did it. Like, if 5% of the world engages in philosophy in the way we're talking about it, that is millions of people, but in a random distribution, it would be difficult to encounter them. Whereas where the internet can make it possible now for people to come together, which means that it becomes easier to see how philosophy is transformative. Whereas before, it would have been much more difficult to see how it is transformative, where the more visual and vivid it becomes to see the transformative nature of philosophy, it gives me hope that more and more people will want to do it, that more and more people will want to engage with it, because there's an entirely different way that people are, and they carry themselves, and they engage, and they do conversation, and how they are in their very being that comes out in community that otherwise doesn't come out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just like, there's something about there's something about being able to really kind of relish in your own existence, in existence itself, that's really important. I think sometimes there's such a almost apologetic nature, like even if you go to the grocery store and like somebody's standing in the aisle and it's just like everyone's like, oh, sorry, I'm like taking up space. It's just like, sorry, I exist, sorry, I'm breathing.
Yes.
It's like, don't apologize, it's all right. It's just very interesting. I wonder if we also have become like more like because the private and public spaces have become more inverted with technologies, that we there is almost more of an apology for being like phenomenologically present.
Absolutely.
and so I think that being able to have this sort of real, it's like you do yourself a favor actually by just allowing yourself to cultivate your own ability to philosophize and to transform in that process. And also that's you also give that favor to those you are engaging with as well.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I always think about is that very weird verse or line where I think in John maybe 15 something, where Jesus says something like, if I would have never come, you would have never known that you were sinners. You would have never, it's like really weird, because then you're kind of like, oh, well, maybe it'd been better off if Jesus didn't come, because we wouldn't have known, right? Well, I think it becomes easier to understand what's going on there, because it's similar with philosophy, like, what would have been better? There's always this tension of, look at these, maybe philosophy just makes you miserable, right? There's a lot of people who aren't philosophical, and they seem to be happy, right? They seem to be getting by, and maybe philosophy doesn't, so it's kind of weird. Well, the thing is, if Jesus doesn't come, then there can be no community. There can be no Holy Spirit. But the possibility of the Holy Spirit, like, coming where two or more are gathered, it's in community that you see why it's better that Jesus came versus not. Like, when you're alone, it's kind of like, well, maybe it'd be better if Jesus didn't come, because then I could just be one of the members of the community that's normal and part of the everydayness and not have to worry about it. And maybe that would be better. Well, when you gather with where two or more are gathered, then that's where the Holy Spirit, there is no possibility of the Holy Spirit unless Jesus comes to earth, right? Because the Holy Spirit is released at Calvary when Jesus dies, and it's his breath, right? Well, likewise, there's no possibility of philosophical community unless there is the individual existential possibility and difficulty of philosophy. But it is precisely because of that existential anxiety that it is possible to have this new type of community, but it has to come to the place of that community. The community has to form, which then means engaging in the practices of community, which, Voicecraft is focused on. And it is in those kind of places like Voicecraft that you see why philosophy is transformative. But if you don't enter into those communities, you don't see it. It doesn't come out. It is not so vivid. So the importance of things like what Voicecraft does is just paramount.
Yes, absolutely. Looking forward to everybody crafting their voice.
Yes, absolutely. October 10th.
Yes.
I think there's Voicecraft. You can find information there. I'm extremely grateful for that community.
Yes.
What everyone does, Mr. Adlin and Tyler and Adria, all the different people who I appreciate very much. And again, how philosophy is transformative comes out with others. And so entering into a space and learning the art of engaging in philosophy with others and with oneself to help become other, as Hegel will describe, it unleashes that spirit that we've been getting at. And it's better to live a spirited life than not.